Hello world, you're watching Homeschooling Scientist, and this is our U.S. history class. We are finishing up talking about World War I. Yeah. So before we jump into the new stuff for today, I just want to make a few comments about the draft and stuff that we talked about in our last video. So one of the things that we talked about was sort of conscientious objector status. And if you remember what that means is like people who say, I don't believe I should be killing, so therefore I don't want to go to war. And can you kind of get out of the draft by saying like, hey, I don't believe that we should fight this war. I don't believe in killing people. I don't want to be a soldier. And I tried to look up statistics on how often that actually happens. There just isn't a lot of statistics out there, I don't think, on it from what I could see. So the only statistics I could find was from like early 2000s. And we had like stuff going on in the Middle East back then, but it really wasn't a full-out war. Like there was military engagements and operations happening at that time in like Afghanistan and stuff, but it wasn't really like a full-out war. Like we weren't fighting a country that was an actual threat to us. At that point in time, people, whether you got accepted or rejected on your application as a conscientious objector, was about 50-50 from the statistics I could find. I imagine if we were in a war today, like a major war like World War I, World War II, if we were in a war like that, my guess is the percentage of people who would be allowed out of the draft as a conscientious objector would probably go down, possibly way down, depending on how bad the war is, right? But there's not a whole lot of information out there on that right now in terms of actual solid statistics. So we also the other day, as part of our school that we do, that's not lectures that we put on YouTube, watched some videos on Alvin York, and yeah, you can clap for that. Alvin York, and I can't believe we went through a whole video and did that. We were talking about the draft and conscientious objector status and should Christians be involved in war and killing. I can't believe we did just about a whole video on that and didn't talk about Alvin York, because that was kind of his thing. If you're not familiar with Alvin York, there's an old movie that covers him. I'm sure there's plenty of stuff on YouTube, books. Pick your poison, basically, as to how you want to read or study about him. But he's a person I would very strongly recommend for you guys to study if you haven't. Fascinating character. A very brief overview. He was a guy, kind of a regular guy from middle of nowhere Tennessee. Grew up, his dad died when he was young, kind of got into drinking and gambling and a lot of bad stuff, and then basically got saved, became a Christian, turned his life around, went from this guy that everybody was scared of to like Sunday school teacher and whatever else, and became a really example of a great Christian guy. And then got drafted in World War I and struggled a lot with, is it okay to kill? And he was trying to get conscientious objector status, and so that he could get out of the war, because he didn't feel like it was right as a Christian to go and kill. And so a good part of his story is him wrestling with, thou shalt not kill, versus, as a Christian, do I have a responsibility to go fight in a war to protect the innocent? And can we create peace through fighting? And however you view that, it's still, I think, a fascinating story to go through, and something I think we should wrestle with as Christians. whatever, however you end up viewing that, I think it is important for us to understand that taking life is a serious thing. And even if we all do agree that, self-defense is okay and we can fight in wars as long as it's a just war, I think it's still something that it's good to wrestle with on a personal level, because taking a life should never be something that's done as a simple thing. So Alvin York wrestles with that. He actually ends up getting his conscientious objector status approved, but from conversations that he had with some of the other Christian guys in the army, decides, no, I'm actually going to go ahead and fight in this war.
There was like a guy higher rank, and he talked with them, and they ended up throwing Bible verses at each other for over an hour.
Yeah, so that's the thing. He ends up deciding, I think actually, I should go fight in this war. I think that's, what I should do as a Christian. And for him, it was about protecting people and trying to create peace and things like that. So he goes, fights in World War I. Long story short, becomes a war hero. This battle where he... kind of the battle that made him famous was this big offensive, and he ends up capturing like 130 German soldiers.
I think it was 130.
132, yeah. And I think he killed like 20 or 30 or something like that. And I think to me, I think that's awesome, and just sort of goes to show... It speaks well to his story of like a guy who didn't want to kill, and the fact that he captured like 5 times as many soldiers as he killed, which is pretty cool.
So they were all shooting at him, and he dropped his canteen. He didn't even get a scratch, but the canteen that he dropped, there were 18 bullet holes in it.
Yeah, so there was a lot of crazy things that happened, and I think it's, again, to me it's fascinating, because I think it's one of those stories you look at and you're like, this guy had to have had God protecting him, everything that happened, and one of the videos we watched, they were talking about how they went back and looked at where he was laying and shooting from, and like the spot he was laying was untouched, but it was like just bullet holes, just hundreds of bullet holes riddled all around that one spot. And they interviewed him and the people with him and the people, even some of the Germans that he was fighting against, and they were like, we couldn't shoot the guy. Like, I don't know what happened, but like bullets couldn't touch him somehow. But yeah, I think it just is a fascinating story that you look at it and you're just like, man, I don't know how you can read his story and not think that God was protecting this dude. Anyway, Alvin York, Sergeant York is the movie. Take some time, read a story, watch a YouTube video on him, watch the movie if you want. He's a really fascinating character to look into. All right, so kind of we left off, we talked about how America entered the war, there was a draft, we start sending soldiers in. Now remember, the war had been going on for a couple years at this point before America even got involved, right? We were neutral for most of the time after the Zimmerman telegram, where Germany tried to convince Mexico to attack us, and Americans like, okay, we're in this war now. The war overall lasts for 4 years, so it's 1914 to 1918. And again, I think we're not going to talk about too much about the war itself and going into like all the battles and stuff. But if you watch like Sergeant York and everything, again, because they sort of have some recreations of like what those battles look like, that's also a great reason to sort of watch that movie. They try to make it, fairly accurate as to what, what that war was actually like. And so you'll kind of see the trench warfare and, all that stuff. Another thing I want to mention, and we kind of talked about this a little bit after our previous video, that this was one of the interesting things in World War One. This was one of the first wars where women were allowed to join the military. The first war for America where women were allowed to sort of officially serve in the military. I remember you asked at one point, do women get drafted? And to this date, no. The draft focuses on like young men. Now, women can serve in the military as like a volunteer, and in our military today, women can even serve in like combat roles and things like that. And you know, I'm sure debate to be had on whether or not that's a good thing and whether women should be allowed to fight in wars and stuff. I think that's beyond the scope of what we're going to do here. Yeah, so World War I was kind of the war where that started. But back then, you know, women, when they were serving in the military, typically it was more like clerks and nurses and kind of desk jobs, if you will. But they at least were allowed to sort of officially join the military. With the way things are going in the world, maybe if we have like a World War III, God forbid, maybe women will get drafted. Who knows? Hopefully we never have to find out. War overall lasts for 4 years. The good guys win, as I said, right? And the good guys being America and the Allies, the Allied powers. So the Central Powers, you know, they surrender. There's a lot of consequences to this war in terms of like land being surrendered and divided up and split up. And again, in my mind, that's more of like world history, so we're not going to do that a lot here. But just know that because of a lot of the stuff that happened in World War One, led into World War II. That was one of the, again, this is maybe jumping ahead a bit, but this was one of the things that Hitler used in his rise to power in Germany, was this idea that Germany, when they lost World War I and the other Central Powers, that they really got a bad deal. That Germany needed to rise again and prove to the world that Germany was a superpower that could take everybody on. And you know, that was kind of what he used and the sort of positions that he used to push and kind of gain power in Germany. The other big thing that I want to mention, because this again has a big impact in history, is post-war. So at the end of World War One, the Russian Empire, so remember back then it wasn't just Russia, it was like the Russian Empire. They end up being overthrown by this guy named Vladimir Lenin, and his communists. They kind of take over the Russian Empire and form the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is much more violent. Lenin basically declares that the country is an atheist country, that you know you're officially you're not going to believe in God, and it was very common for them to sort of oppress their opponents and even to murder political opponents and things like this. Not going to say that the Russian Empire was a great place, but certainly the Soviet Union under communist rule and everything got really bad. Now they end up being on our side when we get to talk about World War II, but that was more because the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. Not that we were super friendly with the Soviet Union, but more that we had a common enemy in the Nazis in World War II.
So we fight the common enemy and then we fight each other.
Long story short, there's kind of ripples that this all has that last throughout history and even impact us today. But I think the last thing that I'll say about that is just that, to me, it's fascinating that socialism, even though there have been so many countries throughout the world, throughout history, that have taken on this kind of socialist form of government, communism, which communism is basically just socialism taken to the full extent. And it essentially has the idea of, like, everybody shares stuff, which sounds nice on paper in theory, but what it really means is, like, the government takes what you own, whatever you work for, the government takes it and uses it however it sees fit, right? And oftentimes the people in power become very rich, and the common people that live under communism and socialism become very poor. It very frequently happens. And there's all kinds of cases of this throughout history. Again, this is more of a war history thing, but I figure it's worth at least talking about a little bit, because socialism and communism are kind of becoming a more popular idea in America these days. Yeah. And which is weird to me, because if you study history, like, everybody looks at the Nazis and they look at Germany in the early 1900s and say, this is terrible, everything that happened. And it was. But then, if you study a lot of the communist countries, they are just as bad, if not worse, in terms of, the dictators and killing their own people and persecuting people and no free speech and, so on and so forth. And so it's really interesting to me and weird that, Nazis get so much hate, which they rightly should, yet communists were just as bad, if not worse, but they are, like, popular for some reason. It's really bizarre, I think. But anyway.
Why do people almost never get rich by being honest?
It's so much easier to get rich by being tricky and cheating and doing shady things, and, just like how, if your whole goal in life is to, get a good grade on a test, then, well, it's easy to cheat on a test, right? And it's easy to lie and cheat and steal to get what you want. But if your goal in life is to, actually learn to be a good person, to do the things that God wants you to do and live the way that God wants you to live, then, certainly lying and cheating and stealing and all this stuff is not the way to go. And it might make you more money, but you're making more money, but you're losing your soul, essentially.
And you also get police after you.
Yeah, and you might get police after you, but, let's just be honest. There's plenty of people who cheat and steal and lie that don't get caught by the cops, and we call them politicians. I say that's a joke. I say that tongue-in-cheek, but, there's a lot of truth said in jokes sometimes, too. I'll just say this. God, again, like we talked about before our Bible class, God is the ultimate judge, right? And I think whether the cops catch them or not, certainly we want the cops to catch murderers, the greedy CEOs and the politicians, the corrupt politicians. Not saying that every politician is corrupt or every CEO is greedy, but certainly some of them are, and plenty of them get away with it.
Or bad police.
Or bad police, yeah. Most police are good, but there are corrupt police out there. And, at the end, God's going to get them all, right? And unlike our justice system, which tries and fails oftentimes to really dish out true justice, we do the best we can, but our justice system is made of people, and people mess up, and people make mistakes, and people are corrupt. But, in the end, we trust that it's God's justice that is going to get everybody in the end, and nobody's going to get away with it. You can get away with it for a little bit, but not forever. All right, I think we're getting pretty sidetracked. Anyway, we've pretty much covered World War One.
To cops.
Yeah, World War One. We're pretty much through it here. So we will start on our next chapter next time. And yeah, you've been watching The Homeschooling Scientist. Peace out.